So I want to welcome all of you. Great. My name is Ida Benke, and I want to welcome you to this conversation between Silvia Federici and Nazila Kivi, which is titled Witches, Work and Women, Revolution from the Kitchen. And this conversation is part of the art biennial LTPH 2020 with the title Patterns in Resistance. And the biennial is hosted by the Factory of Arts and Design in Copenhagen and is curated by the Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology, which I'm part of. So that's why I'm talking to you today. Tonight's event is a sort of a product of collaboration between a handful of wonderful partner organizations that I just want to briefly mention. So it is a collaboration between YNKB, which is an artist group based on the outskirts of Nørrebro, which is the most densely populated area of Copenhagen. YNKB leaves the elitist centers of art in order to establish cultural and artistic activities where people live, using dialogue and participation as a method of involving participants and audiences in common artistic processes. A second partner institution is ANA, or Astrid Noak's Atelier, which is a non-profit artist and curator-run project space located also at Nørrebro. ANA is taking inspiration from the Danish sculptor Astrid Noak, who lived and worked in the space in the middle of the 20th century. And all the programs at ANA intersect and are rooted in modes of slowness and repetition, in order to allow artists to do research and develop projects over several years. And the last partner institution I want to mention is Salon Hysteria, which is a space for next level conversations on society, politics, and science. It is also a space for feminist knowledge production. I also want to mention that today's conversation is the first in a series of summer seminars that are co-produced with LTPH and Salon Hysteria. And the series of summer seminars are titled Hysterical Utopias, and the next seminar will be sometime in August, so stay tuned. And so now I would like to pass on the word to Jon Wedel, who's here to introduce Silvia Federici and Nazila Kivi. Jon is an artist, writer, and organizer. He's educated from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts and the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. Jon is a longtime member of YNKB and has been organizing several talks with Silvia Federici in the past, here in Copenhagen as in Brazil. So I want to thank you, Jon, for doing the introductions. I want to thank all of you that are participating in this seminar from your home. And most of all, I want to thank Silvia and Nazila for doing this with us. So, Jon, I pass the word to you. We don't hear you.
Yes. No?
Okay, now you hear me?
Yes.
We don't hear you, Jon.
Yes. So my name is Jon Wedel. I've been asked to do an introduction of Silvia Federici and Nazila Kivi, as well as just introduce the topic of today's conversation. And I promise to do this very briefly, as we are here to hear the conversations between Nazila and Silvia, and not listen to me. So first of all, I want to say that I'm sad that Silvia could not be with us in Copenhagen. I really looked forward to see you and to spend some time and catch up, but of course it was not possible. But I'm happy nonetheless that this is possible in this space, and I'm happy that we're joined by so many people. So thanks also to the organizers for making this possible. I have known Silvia for more than 10 years, I think, more or less, since I was at the Art Academy and we read Caliban and the Witch back in 2009 or something like this, and we had the privilege to invite you for a workshop, and since then we pretty much stayed in contact and had spent several occasions together in different places. So I'm very grateful for our friendship and also to have the possibility to continue this conversation over so many years. Yeah. So the starting point of of today's conversation came out of Silvia's last visit to Copenhagen, where a group of women brought the lyrics to the very patriotic Danish song Midsummer on the table. And for our international listeners who are not familiar with the Danish midsummer, and I know that probably Nazila is also going to mention this, but really what happens in midsummer is that people meet around a big bonfire and usually they sing this song, and sometimes they also even put a figure of a woman on the bonfire, somehow resembling the witch. It's really crazy to even say this, but yeah. So in the last chorus of the song that is usually being sung, it goes like this: "We will light the fire on the Viking graves of our fathers. Every town has its witch and every parish its trolls. We will keep them from life with the fire of joy." So yeah, it sounds really crazy, but this tradition is actually still going on, and people don't even recognize the femicide that has taken place, and also the cruelty of keeping up with this very misogynist tradition. As with so many other things in Denmark, it's just hygge, as they say, or as we say. So with the midsummer coming up next Tuesday, I believe it is, the initial idea behind the invitation to Silvia was to create an awareness of this horrific tradition while discussing ways to organize against it. Unfortunately, these witch hunts are not just a historical phenomenon or some sick perversion from the past. As Silvia also makes clear in her work, we are in fact witnessing a surge of witch hunts again today, as well as a continuous femicide and an increase of violence against women on a global scale, as we have also seen lately during the confinement under the pandemic. So the production of the figure of this witch, or you might call it the other, and all the oppression and violence that comes with it is still very much present today, and is closely linked to the emergence of capitalism, the subordination of reproductive work, and the disciplining of the body, as Silvia has taught us. Which means that the history of witch hunts today is not only a history of repression against certain forms of knowledges and ways of being, as Nazila, I think, will speak on more about, but it's really an integral part of the capitalist system, whose ultimate function is to produce hierarchies and separations among us in this kind of relentless search for profit. And I believe Silvia's contribution within this struggle cannot be underestimated. So I'll just finish off by reading like a more formal introduction, excuse me. So Silvia Federici is a lifelong feminist activist, writer, teacher, and scholar in the feminist Marxist tradition. She's the author of numerous books on women's struggles and topics such as reproductive labor, prison abolition, agriculture, and the effects of globalization, alongside a rare and tireless militant engagement in a worldwide struggle dedicated to defend the collective and communal forms of life, and in order to resist the violent and catastrophic destruction of patriarchal capitalism. She was a co-founder of the International Wages for Housework campaign, together with activists such as Selma James and Maria Rosa de la Costa. She worked as a teacher in Nigeria for many years, is also the co-founder of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, and a member of the Midnight Notes Collective. Her 2004 groundbreaking book, Caliban and the Witch, has been translated into more than 15 languages, I think, and still keeps inspiring feminist movements all over the world, especially in these days in Latin America, as I've seen it with my own eyes, where Silvia has spent more and more time in the last couple of years. Other titles by Silvia Federici include Revolution at Point Zero, Re-enchanting the World, Witches, Witch Hunts, and Women, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. And I just saw recently that you're coming up with a new book this summer with the title Patriarchy of the Wage.
Yes.
I look very much forward to read, so that's fantastic news. So today Silvia will be joined by another amazing woman, Nazila Kivi, and Nazila Kivi is an independent scholar, a literary critic, editor, and translator, and works in the intersections of academia, activism, and art. She's the co-founder of the Copenhagen-based feminist magazine Friction. She holds a bachelor's degree in public health science from Copenhagen University, including a gender certificate for her focus on body, gender, and minorities, and an MA in cultural encounters and communication from Roskilde University. She teaches the course From Witches to Cyborgs, Gender, Race, and Resistance. And with these words, I'll shut up and I'll leave the room to you, Nazila. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just lost you, Silvia. Are you back there?
No, I'm here, but
all right.
the mystery of the
Yes.
All right.
Periodically, I think I have to reconnect.
Right.
And so if there are some gaps, hopefully they will not be long.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ida, and thank you so much for the introduction, Jon. And there are now more than 300 people online following, so hello to all of you. Welcome. I just lost Silvia again, but it's the picture.
Beyond, but you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, so this will be, yes, but I will come back hopefully soon.
Yeah, we'll just do it like that. So, yeah, welcome again, Silvia. This is a great pleasure to have you here, even though we were supposed to be here together in Copenhagen, but this is good as well. So, before we start, we briefly talked about that very soon, in a few days, is going to be Sankt Hans. But before we start with that, let's talk about, you mentioned that today is Juneteenth, and since it's not something that's recognized officially, I think maybe we could just take a moment to recognize this day with you. You just told me about what this was. Can you please tell what is Juneteenth?
Absolutely. And first of all, I want to say hello to everybody who is listening, and thank you, Joen, Nazila, Ida, for this introduction and for inviting me here. It's really a great pleasure. I've been to Copenhagen many times, and it has always been really fantastic. Really the warmth and the politics. It's been very important, and to Malmo. So Juneteenth, it's not well known even in the United States, except of course in the Black community, because Juneteenth, which is often referred to as Freedom Day, is the day when people in Texas in 1865, on June 19, 1865, were actually told that slavery was abolished.
Can you turn back your microphone on?
Today, because of course in the middle of the protests, which are protests against the killing of George Floyd, is a protest against police brutality, but it's really much more. It's a protest against the whole system of structural racism, a whole system in which slavery has never really ended, and in which the construction of division has been endless, and in every aspect of everyday economic and social life. We just have seen that during the peak of the pandemic, for example, in New York, 80% of the people who died were in the Black American community, in the Black communities. And Black people have been discriminated systematically as far as housing, as far as jobs, as far as education. Today, the struggle is against all of it. And, the killing of George Floyd is just the last of a number of assassination, conducted by the police, and in which the police have had total immunity. But this is changing. And what we're witnessing now, I think, is the rise of a movement and the rise of transformation of something. It's a very transformative movement. And I know we have a limited time, but I encourage everybody to learn as much as possible. And I know that the protest is going on globally. This movement is giving the power to people in England, South Africa, in every country, because the structural racism is not unique to the United States, though of course it's particularly rooted here because of the history of slavery.
Yeah, and we will get into that also, because something that's very important is also to make a connection between
Of
those.
course, there's a continuity. In fact, in Caliban and the Witch, I've over and over shown that there is a continuity, between the enslavement and the witch hunts, the expulsion of the peasantry in Europe from the land. All these were key moments and instruments, of the capitalist development in the 16th, 17th century. And so it's very important to think of these moments together.
Exactly. So now that we are based here in Copenhagen, we might start with something that is a Danish tradition, and it's going to be next Tuesday, the 23rd, midsummer, 23rd of June, that we used to celebrate this tradition of Sankt Hans, St. John's Eve. And what happens during this tradition is there are beautiful bonfires around near the water and other places. But there is also something that makes this a bit different than many other places that it's celebrated, is that there is a little figure of straw or hay that resembles a witch. We used to burn that. So a symbolic woman, a witch, is burned on the fires around here, and is accompanied by midsummer, which is a celebratory song about expelling the witch from amongst the villages or amongst us.
Right.
So can you tell me, I think we have talked about this some years ago, that about these different places in Europe where there have been the sites of some of the witch trials, right? And so this is not unique to Denmark in the same way. I haven't seen them burned other places, but there are these little figurines of witches, which are like grotesque caricatures of like ugly women or old women. And could you tell me, like, why do we, if we think of in Caliban and the Witch, you describe it as something that could be called a genocide. Why is it that we have this celebratory approach to this killing, this brutal killing of a great number of people?
Yeah, this is very important. There's a lot of things to say. Number one, the burning of the witch is not limited to Denmark. I'm now beginning to discover that it's happening in other places, and not only this so-called tradition has never ended, but it's actually coming back. So for example, I've learned that in Italy, I didn't know, in some town, on December 6th, which is the day of the Befana, there are bonfire and they're burning the figure of a woman, which represents the witch. But not only that, apparently in a kind of, the right-wing revival that is taking place in a number of areas of Europe. For example, in Germany, I understand that now the burning of the witch tradition is being reappropriated in a sort of celebratory mood of, our national culture, who we are, etc., etc. So it is acquiring a much more specific political meaning for the present on the side of right-wing neo-Nazi organization. Now, the question is why this has never been denounced before and has never been terminated. There are very few countries, I must say Norway, and that have made apologies, and in fact have also built monuments, right, to, basically to do justice to the women and the people who were executed. But generally, the witch hunt has completely been ignored, except by very few historians. It's never been taught in the school. It's never really been considered a phenomenon of historical importance. In fact, most people don't even know what it was about. And a kind of a legend has been built around the witch. Oh, the witch who comes on the broom. In the United States, we have, at the end of October, we have trick or treat. The little girl wear the witch's hat, and they go around asking for candy, saying, oh, if you don't give me the candies. So it has been ridiculed. It has been denied in its historical importance, right? And and in fact, what is happening now is that in a number of European areas, where there were a persecution and execution, the witch hunt has been turned into a tourist attraction. I've seen that in England. I've seen that in the north of Spain at the border with France, where you can find emporiums that are selling, the image of the witch on the broom with exactly all the negative characteristics, right? The old woman with a very sadistic, satanic smile. So in fact, myself and other women in Spain, over the last 2 years, we have begun a project. And I'm very, very happy today to be here with you, because I hope the women in Copenhagen will join us, will become part of this project, because next June, we were going to have it now, but next June in 2021, we're going to have a big encounter, the second one in Madrid, in which we are going to expand this project that we have, which is reclaiming the history of the witches, reclaiming the history. And that reclaiming means that now we have women forming study groups, going to the local archives, figuring out who were these women, reading, who were the women who were persecuted, what happened to them, why they were persecuted, and then what it meant, and bringing this information, bringing this history together and understanding collectively from below, what were the consequences, and how they connect with the form of violence that we are experiencing today, how they connect, with the surge in violence, So we have this project, and it's a project that I think is very important. And again, I see that this might be a beginning of a new collaboration on this issue.
Yes, and I think we have spoken about that, about the Witch Museum also in northern Spain on the border. I've been there and talked with them as well.
Exactly. And I want to add something, that the St. John, the fact that this is happening on St. John's Day, or very close, and of course the symbolic is June solstice, and the solstice. Do you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
Just don't see you.
This computer is a bit, this connection is a bit wavering. So the St. John's Day was a special day in medieval culture, in pre-capitalist culture in Europe. This was a day in which, a day of love and health. Love, because there was a whole tradition, St. John's Day was the beginning of summer, midsummer day, right? And in the night of St. John, lovers jumped the bonfire. So the fire was a symbol of love, not of killing. The lovers, they used to jump the bonfire and commit each other. It was a commitment to their love, to marriage, and so on. And then the other thing was about health. The night of St. John was considered very magical. If you were sick, you were told to stay out and to catch the dew because it would heal you. And women on that night would collect herbs like rosemary, lemon, verbena, and then they would hang them, on their doors for health purposes. And then comes the Reformation, comes the Counter-Reformation, comes the witch hunt, and all this is turned in the opposite direction. The fire is used against the witches, the so-called witches, and the herbs that are collected, are supposed to be protecting the homes from evil spirit and from evil women. So this night of St. John is symbolic of the transformation of how, tradition, they were pre-capitalist, they were actually enhancing, right, that expression of a people's culture, and in a positive way, and expressing of a whole collectivity, actually are turned against it.
It's very interesting because in Iranian culture, as I am familiar with, we also celebrate the midsummer, and it's called Tirgan, and it's a celebration of water. So you have like water fights, and where we actually jump over a fire in the 21st of March, which is the spring equinox. That's the new year. So these are very connected with each other. I see a lot of actually Danish and Nordic traditions that have equivalents in the ancient Persian, and they're both like the pre-Islamic and pre-Christian. So they are really connected. Just wanted to comment on that.
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
But I want to get back to this trajectory of politicizing the history of the witch hunts, because in popular culture we often see witches as these like evil magical or black magic figures that are old and ugly, green, like. But if you think about, so it becomes into both a caricature but something that goes in the realm of fantasy. So it's almost hard to imagine anyone actually looking like that or existing. So I want to ask you to tell us a bit about who were the real people who were burned, because if you go back in historical files, they weren't these old green-shaped women with the pointy hats. That was something that was put on them. So who were they? Who were the people who were burned during the witch hunts?
Okay, I think that in order to understand who were the people who were burned, we have to understand that the advent of capitalism in Europe provoked an enormous transformation. We now think of the economy as something that is separate, that it is a terrain of its own. No way. In order to implant, to develop a capitalist economy, everything had to be changed, right? People's most basic practices in terms of reproduction, in terms of cultural conception, in terms of their relationship to life, to love, to nature, to animal. So we are talking about major, I use the concept of the world turned upside down, and in a very negative way, right? And the witch hunt takes place at this moment, at the moment of capitalist development, new relationships that are profoundly transforming the life of people, that are expropriating a lot of people from the land. So the creation of massive people of poor, vagabond. We also have, a whole process of increase in the cost of prices, of basic necessities. So, and the imposition of a whole new discipline, a new social discipline, functional to the new forms of work, functional to the new forms of social control, right? So the classical witch, right? And of course, there are many variations depending on the countries. But the classical witch, first of all, is an older woman who lives alone and is poor. So poverty is a fundamental element of the witch hunts, right? For example, and this is very true in Denmark. It's true in England. It's always a component. The witch in Denmark, for instance, is in many cases a woman who is a beggar, who asks the people in our community who are more affluent to help her with some food, with some meat, etc. She's refused and she's cursing. And then the person falls sick and they accuse her. This is one classical example. Another example has to do with land. You have the small peasant holder, so who now comes into conflict, with the new big landowners. And that's a connection that is often found. The big landowners are often the accusers, and those who are struggling, holding on to a little piece of land. So you have stories of women, and I'm speaking of Denmark, right, who are now accused of being witches after disputes about land and disputes about animals. Her cow went on his land, and she protested, she cursed him, etc., etc. A lot of charges against women had to do with the accusation that they bewitched animals, that they caused the damage in terms of the making of the milk, the making of the cheese. So there's a very, very fundamental class element to it. There's a very strong class element. The other kind of accusation, and usually they came together, are accusations that have to do with the women's morality. The 16th century and the rise of capitalism, which goes hand in hand, and the two are very connected. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. The two are very connected, goes hand in hand with the Reformation. In fact, a whole new code, the Copenhagen Code, the Articles of Copenhagen are introduced after, the rise of Lutheranism in Denmark, right? In 1536, practical Lutheranism becomes, the official religion. And this spawns, two sets of a new legal understanding of witchcraft and more severe penalties. New laws are passed again in 1617, right? And in fact, by 1617, as in the rest of Europe, all you had to do to be accused of being a witch. You didn't have to have, even been accused of any particular crime. All you had to do is that you were accused of being a servant of the devil, to have made a pact with the devil, which is also a very interesting pact. The pact with the devil is the pact where the woman decides to serve the devil, and he promises her that she's not going to have to worry about any economic issue. He will take care of her. And in fact, he supposedly gives her some money, something, right? So that too shows that the woman is a woman in need. In fact, the devil shows up when the woman is in need.
Yes. I can hear you still.
Okay. I see the screen going black.
Yeah, it is.
So, but I was saying that the other element is the question of social discipline and, the woman, the creation of a new kind of family, and a more strict discipline of labor, which immediately is reflected into the discipline of women's sexuality. So we have many accusations that are coming from the fact that the woman is a whore, fornication, having extramarital affair, premarital affairs, right? And so the sexual behavior of a woman now begins to be very much under the spotlight. And this is a constant theme all throughout Europe. The witch is a beggar or is a woman who is seen as a prostitute, seen as a loose woman, right? And this certainly is the case for in Denmark as well.
Yeah, and just to now that we are in Denmark, we can say that especially in the 17th century, there was a peak in the witch hunts in Denmark that especially between 1617 and 1625, as you have documented, there were 297 trials in Denmark within that short time period, and the highest concentration of anywhere. Yeah, and the most of the people who were charged were women.
Yes.
Something else that you said is very interesting is that when it goes to the sexuality and reproduction, is that there is like this horrible big book that is the Hammer of Witches.
Oh yes.
Which is also really right. And it's interesting that it has some well, I guess if you know the history, there are some threads going back to the idea of women being hysterical, which was connected to the body. And in the ancient Greek, the women who were hysterical were described as people who did not have children, who were not interested in men, who were not married. So we don't know if those were, in a way, people also who did not conform to these ideas of family, even though it started in a whole different level in the from the 15th century. But it has some historical connotations and historical threads. But something I would like, and this will take us to especially the reproduction, but I have promised some viewers because this idea of the land and the appropriation of the land. For example, in Denmark, if you were convicted of being a witch, the person who accused you took over your land and your possessions. So it is really much also a question of wealth and power. And this is something you really document in Caliban and the Witch, where it's a central concept is primitive accumulation. And I have promised some of the listeners to have you define for the newcomers and people who would like to have it repeated. Can you tell us what is primitive accumulation?
Right. Well, it's a concept. It's a technical term. Actually, it seems that the person who used it first was Adam Smith, and then the concept was very much popularized by Marx, because Marx takes it over, and he devoted a whole section of Capital Volume 1 to primitive accumulation. And basically, he described primitive accumulation, right, is that period, in which capitalism develops. And he calls it primitive originary. Probably in German, the better translation would be originary, the first. And the reason, he calls it this way is because his argument is that in order for capitalism to take off as a system, certain conditions had to be there. Certain conditions had to be met. And primitive accumulation is the name that he gives, to the period in which those conditions were created. What were those conditions? And he mentions two, which I think are very important. Yeah? One is the accumulation of a proletariat. what does it mean, accumulation of a proletariat? In order to exploit people, you have to have, in the capitalist sense, right, of imposing on them certain forms of work, certain forms of exploitation. Exploitation being the difference between what they produce and what they receive in exchange. In order to exploit them, which means you give them less and less than what they are producing, in order to do that, you have to have people who have nothing, who have absolutely nothing. If you have people who have land, they have trade, they can support themselves autonomously, you will not be able to exploit them. So one condition, right, Marx argues, for the construction of a capitalist system is to accumulate the proletariat, which means to expropriate millions of people in Europe and then, of course, in Latin America from the land and every means they had to reproduce themselves, right? To create a mass. And so we have, what do we have? We have the expropriation of the European peasantry from the land that they had used. We have years and years the slave trade, you know, masses, millions of people brought, kidnapped, enslaved. And then, you know, we have also the expropriation of the indigenous population of the Americas, right? So this is one condition. And the other, which is very connected, is the creation of a land market. In other words, the creation of the condition where land can be used not for sustenance, but to produce crops for commercial use. And Denmark was right there, because Denmark is one of the greatest exporters of grain. So the grain of Denmark is not used to feed its population. But Denmark, as part of the Hanseatic League, right, is one of the great exporters. So more and more you have a land market. Land is bought and sold, right, which is connected with the expropriation of people from it. So that's primitive accumulation. So primitive accumulation is all those means by which people were enslaved, by which people were expropriated of the land. And I place the witch hunt there, because the creation of this regime of terror against women, it was very, very important. It was important to create a new discipline for women, but it was also important to defeat the whole peasant community or the artisan community in the town, because you had witch hunts also in the town. And there again, you have the small artisan, you have the people who are in the lower level of the social scale, right? And it's important to remember that often you also have poor people attacking, you know, other poor people, right? But it has often been shown that those accusations coming from the poor often were due to the fear of falling into even greater poverty, right? In other words, the not so poor would accuse the poorest of all to protect themselves, right? So it becomes complicated. You know, the witch hunts lasted for a long time. So eventually they're used in many ways. Fundamentally, there is a clear class and gender content to them. You know, in terms of the discipline of labor, property relation, and the discipline of the family, sexuality, procreation.
I want to get back to this, the whole idea of reproduction, and because the primitive accumulation, the way you describe it, if one would take the liberty to call it that, it was like early land grabbing. something that is happening today in outside of the Western countries, especially in places of conflict. It's very easy to just slide in for big mega multinational companies and just buy land. It happens in Syria, for example, or on the African continent. And this land grabbing or the primitive accumulation is very much connected to, as you said, sustenance and the idea to be able to reproduce life, to feed yourself, right? And that's one part of the reproduction. But then we have land, if we want to try to make a bit of structure of this talk. So we have the land, and we have like the economic incitation to grab the land and to grab the labor that is in that, right? But then there is the third, if we'd make it triangular, is the people, right? Yes. So who are the people that are supposed to be the workers? We need to have enough of those in order to have enough workers.
Exactly.
And so you could say you would have the poor class of Europe, you would have the enslaved of the New World and from the African continent, and also you have the work of women.
Yeah, and the control of procreation.
Exactly. So if we start with the last first, because we will get onto the colonization and how that is connected to the witch hunts. But if we start with the idea of the feminized body and reproduction, is something that is also really part of something you also describe. What happened? Like, why did the birth of new humans, which was something that had been done by midwives and like wise women or wise men or different people who knew about this, who had this knowledge, slowly they lost this power over, or this knowledge, which was really important, and then it became appropriated by the state.
Right.
Can you tell me, you start with the Black Death, right, of Europe?
Yeah.
That was a pivotal moment. Can you tell about what happened since whole reproduction went from being centered around the person to centered falling in the hands of the state?
Yeah, that very important. And there are so many issues involved. There's a major transformation in the organization of reproduction, in the transition from a feudal economy to a capitalist economy. One major transformation is that production and reproduction begin to separate. This is something that most economists, even the Marxists, never talked about, never understood. But actually, this is one of the most important developments in the development of capitalism. The fact that only one part of the activities that are producing goods is recognized. This is the production of goods for the market. The other activity, which is the activity that are producing the life of people, the cooking, the cleaning, the raising of children, all of that disappear, does not appear any longer as having any economic impact. Whereas with the women's movement, we saw that this is exactly the opposite, because in reality, these activities are very, very much involved in the production of capital, in capitalist accumulation, because they are producing the workers who are producing the commodities, right? So in fact, we saw the reproductive work, which capitalism does not recognize as labor, completely devalued, in reality is the support system, is the pillar of every other economic activity. Without workers, you don't have any other economic activity. And we began to understand, in fact, all the activities that are considered natural, domestic work, the way we live as women, our sexuality, actually in capitalism, they've been appropriated. They've been appropriated and they've been organized in a way that is functional, not to our well-being, but to the production, to the labor market, right? So this is very, very important. And part of this process is the fact that the state more and more takes over the control over women. The state becomes the one who controls more and more directly the reproduction process. And for example, begins a whole legislation with concerning procreation, banning abortion, right? Banning contraception for a long time. Imagine, not until the 20th century, we have been able to freely use contraceptive. I mean, even in the 40s and 50s, you couldn't buy contraceptive. That's amazing. Of course, the whole legislation concerning women's sexuality, concerning marriage. Why the state does that? Why the state, who is the representative of the capitalist class? They do that because they recognize the left didn't for a long time. The left did not. But the state recognized very clearly, that the family, sexuality, housework are fundamental, for the functioning of the capitalist system, for the functioning of the labor market, the organization of work. And so I think looking at the witch hunt from this point of view, from the understanding that we developed of reproductive work and the whole sphere of reproductive activity, looking back from that window into the witch hunt, we realized that the witch hunt was extremely important. It was a milestone on the path of creating this new discipline, on the path of creating this new reorganization of reproductive work, and the confinement of women to that, and the devaluation of women's work, and the naturalization to make it appear, oh, this is all natural, it's nothing to do with capitalism, it's not production, it's just, it's women's bodies, women's mind, women's personality.
And the idealization of motherhood as something that was natural, and not working, but something that was specifically reserved for middle class women, right? Because this idea of the weak, fragile woman who better sit at home and raise children and knit, that was only reserved for middle class women, because as a migrant, as an enslaved woman, as a working class woman, you didn't have that luxury. So you still had to work. So you had the double burden of still doing the productive work outside home and going back home and doing the reproductive work.
And in fact, when you look at the condition of women in slavery, there you see capitalism at its truest. Because you see, for example, that in the United States, enslaved women, particularly in Virginia, not only were forced to do, all the work of slaves, but they were forced to procreate. They were raped. They were raped in a way that would force them to become pregnant and to produce slaves to then be sold at the auction. Now, you have to understand, you have to really look at this and think about it to understand what a brutal system, the capitalist system. We are talking now about the 19th century. We are not talking about, any so-called primitive world. We are talking about 19th century. We are talking about the United States at the peak of capitalist development. Massively, women were raped and forced to procreate, and then their children were taken away from them and sold at the auction. There's a whole literature upon that. I think it will be very, very important for people to read about it.
Yeah, and now that we see statues being toppled over, I think one good example.
Good riddance.
Good riddance, absolutely. I think one example of a statue that there have been a long time with activism to topple was who is called the father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims,
Yes.
who actually did his tests and his experiments on enslaved Black women because he wanted to cure their vaginal fistulas that were the result of giving birth too early or too often, or having very long duration birth periods. And he purchased these women as enslaved and then did the experiments on them without any anesthesia. And he when he succeeded to find a way to cure them, then he went on to cure white middle-class women using anesthesia this time, right? And I think in some way that I think the reproduction and sexuality and gynecology is very much connected to the witch hunts is something that is interesting from the United States point of view, is that there were a lot, is also part of the commercialization of medical health, the medical profession. Because in the United States, there were many of the people who were accused of being witches were actually midwives, or they were people who were said like, hey, you feel sick, here's a cup of tea, because it was very important to monopolize health in a way, right? So it's connected in many different threads, that with both the enslavement of women, the whole reproductive system, and forcing women to give birth to property, right? Absolutely. And then also the like giant health crisis that is in the United States today is also like a following of this, of monopolizing health for a very little, like capitalizing people's health.
I think it's very important to bring that out, because this whole question of the relation of women and the witch hunt to the rise of the medical profession, and it's not just the United States, all over Europe. In pre-capitalist Europe, I mean, the woman in the village, she was the healer, because it was the woman who knew about the property of plants, the property. Every woman had a certain garden, and they knew, in a rural community, you didn't have a doctor. The doctor as a figure emerges much, much later in the 16th, 17th century. But among people, you had a woman that cured animals as well as humans. And so there was a whole knowledge about contraception, for instance, about medicines. We know now that in the arboretum of the witches, there were many herbs that are still used today by official medicine, and they were a threat. They were a threat because there was a social power. They were very, very much in demand in the community, and so they had to destroy that female power in order to create these new forms of subordination. And so what you have is not only the destruction of women's body and practices, it's also, you called it very properly, epistemocide, the destruction of a whole range of knowledges, about herbs, about the body, about contraception, medical knowledges about nature, that I think is very important. And it's important because this was done not only in the case of women and the witch hunts. For example, in the slave plantation of the United States, African women had come with a whole set of knowledges about plants, and they used them as contraceptive, to prevent giving birth to children who then would have to become slaves, who then would be done, and they used them. So there was a whole destruction, and that destruction of knowledges is an element that is part of every process of colonization. What was done, for instance, in Latin America? It's amazing, right? A lot of the accumulated knowledge of pre-capitalist society was destroyed, burned, given to the flames. So this is another aspect, of so-called primitive accumulation that we have to add. Certainly Marx does not talk about, but that is very, very important.
Yeah, because it's also, like apart from epistemicide, is also epistemological violence, because I have a theory that at that time witches were the most scientific and evidence-based knowledge workers and health workers, because it was a knowledge of plants and herbs that were based on hundreds of years of error and trial, and they knew, and the whole problem is that at that time the other two competitors were the church, who sold prayers if you were sick, or the early doctors who did this, like the suction with the cup, or I don't remember what it's called, when you open the vein, which was completely unscientific. So in order for them to gain ground, they had to get rid of the people who actually had real knowledge. And as you say, a lot of those plants have been used now, but now they are patented, right? So some few people can profit from them. So it's also part of, like, this epistemicide is that the common knowledge was appropriated and extracted into very few hands, right? And then we talked about colonization.
Yes.
And
yeah.
And for that, I would really like to read something short for you from the Colombian scholar Julia Suarez Cabe, who has written this really wonderful text called The Conditions That Make a Difference, that really concisely describes what is the relation between the witch hunts and the colonization. So allow me. Indeed, coloniality took shape through 6 processes of extermination that involved the populations of indigenous people, Roma, Latinos and Latinas, and people of the African descent, Muslims and Jews. And they are historically simultaneous with the rise of Europe as a global imperial power. In a period of 10 years, around the end of 1400, the following key events took place in Europe. The witch hunts had begun. Al-Andalus, the remaining Muslim society, had been conquered. The largest expulsion of Jews from Christian soil had been accomplished. Colonization of the Americas had started. The transatlantic slave trade was established. And legal measures to expel the Roma population had been inaugurated. So these 6 historical moments are pivotal to the configuration of coloniality. So I see the connection. I want to bring this out because I would like to expand this from, we started with the Danish setting and then the European and went to the United States. I would like to expand this to also a global perspective, because you actually describe well in Caliban and the Witch about the persecution of the New World, of people in the New World, and how they were accused also of sorcery and witchcraft, and among others of cannibalism, in order to justify to the people back home, for example, in Spain, to that they were not completely to be humanized, right? So it was part of the dehumanization of the people in the New World. Can you tell me more about, because you also talk about the African knowledge systems, right? And we talked about this, the epistemicide is also part of erasing other forms of knowledge.
It's very important, because the witch hunt is fundamental also for the question of colonization, and in so many different ways, and to the question of slavery. because, for instance, over and over and over, you find that, the slave rebellion, right, were people, enslaved, and particularly women, were accused of inciting slave rebellion also by using magical means. So the whole accusation of witchcraft enters into the repression.
The voodoo, right? Also,
voodoo.
the accusations of voodoo as a black magic.
Yeah, and I want to say, and I'll come back to it, that is continuing into the present, because actually continues into the present. And but more broadly, from the very beginning, I mean, in fact, there is almost a one-to-one correspondence to the growth of colonization in Mexico, for instance, and the expansion of the witch hunt, the expansion of colonization, and the growth of the witch hunt in Europe. And in fact, there is a whole discussion, not a whole discussion, because only a few historians have looked into it. One in particular in Italy, the question of what comes first. In Caliban and the Witch, I mentioned a historian, Parinetto, who makes an argument that it was in fact the process of colonization, particularly in Mexico, what we call Mexico today, that was responsible for the massification of witch hunting in Europe. In other words, what happened in his view, right? The colonizers, the Spaniards, they go to Mexico and then they expand into the region of the Andes, what we say Peru today.
Peru and Bolivia, yes. Mm.
And they begin to blame, they begin to accuse the whole indigenous population of being witches, of being servants, the idea of the red devil, of being all the rituals and so on are now being accused. Then they go into Brazil, and here they accuse them of cannibalism, etc., right? And Parinetto's argument is that it was from that encounter that they gave a new push to the witch hunting. I think it's a whole questionable, but certainly there is a profound connection between the two. Profound connection, and yes, there is a demonization of the population of the Americas that is totally instrumental to their annihilation, to their expropriation. And particularly in countries like part of Mexico, Colombia, fundamental, Brazil, right? The places where, and the Andean region, the region of the Andes. So the charge of demonism, the charge of witchcraft, which in times, at first, it's a very broad one, men and women. With time, it becomes more concentrated on women. There is a book by Irene Silverblatt, which I quote in Caliban and the Witch, which demonstrates this change, how more and more the witch becomes the woman. But very generally, indigenous people are considered servants of the devil. And you see a consequence of that also in the United States, in the famous trial of Salem, right? Which is always given a great prominence. But in reality, the witch hunts in the American continent, were far, far more wide than Salem. But in Salem too, the attack on the indigenous people was a key element. In fact, Cotton Mather and some of the others persecutors made it very clear. We have this in Salem because we are in an area, of course, was the area of the Six Nations. The Six Nations, which then were defeated later. We are in an area which is dominated by people who have devils, right? So the accused, the charge of being subhuman, of being demonic, right, has been really used by the church and by colonization at all levels in every country where they've gone. And the Inquisition, for example, was active in Brazil, was active in Colombia, and there was a constant exchange between the witch hunters at home in Europe and the witch hunters, in the Americas. And it has left a legacy. It has left a very, very important legacy that continues today. When we have new evangelical drives, new Pentecostal evangelical drive connected with right-wing organization, very, very often, right? Using again, the charge of witchcraft, to subdue people.
Yeah. I think it's also gets us back to the idea of this epistemicide, because by exterminating people, exterminating their ways of living, these so-called alternative forms of knowledge, we have also exterminated, committed epistemicide that also affects us in a way today into our relationship to nature, right? Because there are some, again, decolonial scholars who talk about that the way we see nature, also post primitive accumulation, is as property and as an infinite resource to be used and to be profited from, while in many, I don't mean to romanticize the indigenous, it's not like that everything was better or they didn't make any mistakes, but there are many indigenous languages where the idea of nature includes every living thing, including the humans in that, right? So there have been these ways of seeing the nature and the ways of seeing the production of food, the production of human, that is all been connected together. And this is just like you say, this happened, this separation with us, that is part of this epistemicide, the killing of knowledge.
And in fact, in the Americas, let's say in North America, the indigenous population, they had this concept that what you do has to be good for the next 7 generations. This was not just an ideology, because there is an agreement. There is a general agreement by historians that when the Europeans arrived in North America, they found in areas, terrains that had hardly been, they had no trace of destruction, because the whole economy of indigenous people was directed not to accumulation, not to property accumulation, but it was directed to simple use. And so, and it's very interesting the way it was done, because, for example, in one area, more than one population could have access to it, because it was understood, for instance, that you could have multiple use. Some people may use the land to plant a few things, Others could use the land simply for medical purposes, and so forth. But whatever, they did not affect the land in the way in which the European and the capitalist economy did, where in the space of 2 centuries, they have done more destruction than in the previous 2,000 years, to the point that now the land is totally exhausted. They have to continue to put more chemicals into it, more herbicide, more pesticide. The land, the food has no nutrient. It's really poisonous, because it comes from a land which has absorbed so much chemical that this is what creates all the epidemic of cancer. We are now all worried about COVID. In the United States, 10 times more people die every year. Maybe not 10 times, but last year in the United States, 500,000 people died of cancer, or developed very, very serious condition. So cancer has become a broad, worldwide epidemic, coming from the destruction of the land. So definitely there is a profound connection there.
So I want to try to sum up some of the things that we've been talking about in order to also open up for some questions, because I see there are a lot of the listeners commenting still. So just a second, there you go. And what we have been talking about is like starting from the witch hunts, that is something to that seems to be in the past, but in many ways is connected to the way the reproduction has taken place, the way the monopolization of healthcare, the way that the population control also today, something that we didn't get into, but I would just mention in the passing that today there's constantly talk of overpopulation in the poorer parts of the world, while at the same time white middle class women are encouraged to have children. So there is a great disparity of how we view different people's reproduction, which also is connected to the whole idea of migration, which is also something that we could have talked about for a long time.
I want to say something here, which is very important to see. That all this attack on migration and all this attack on, all this talk about population explosion in Africa, population being the cause of poverty, all of this is connected with the fact that people in Africa, Latin America have been struggling to reappropriate what was taken away from them. And that migrant people who have come to Europe or have come to the United States have also been struggling. For example, they've been struggling not to be treated like slaves, to have rights, to have decent ways of living and decent ways of working, etc. So I think this is important because there is this image, cultivated by the nationalists too, which is that, governments are against migrants. No, they are not against migrants. They want migration if the migrants accept to come as slaves. If the government do not demand to be treated as human beings.
Because they're very dependent on the migrant work.
Exactly. It's only when the migrants say, no, I want to be able to have a decent house. I want to be able to be compensated on an equal basis. I want to be able to bring my, my family here, have children, etc. Then you begin the whole attack and the whole use of this racist, nationalist ideology. And it's very important to see that.
Again, it's also connected to land, as we've spoken about, because this idea of land and this idea of putting women and feminized bodies as metaphors for the land, because, for example, the right-wing group saying like they come to take our women as if women were property, right? As if they were land, or talk about this invasion, even when it's about white women dating black and brown men. So in that way, it's also connected that the sexuality, reproduction, migrations, as why these are all part of, even though it might seem like a big issues to grasp, but it's important to just like sum up by the notion that they are very much connected with each other, right? So do you want to say something also concluding before we open up for some questions? I see there are tons of comments and we will start to open up for questions, but please, if you have a concluding remark before we open.
I concluded about two things. I mean, there are many, but two things. One is the important to see the connection of all this struggle. I think that starting from the witch hunt, and we haven't talked about animals, because the witch hunt, I think that starting from the witch hunt, we can begin to see the connection between a lot of struggles that are crucial for us if we want to change this world, if we want to construct, the struggle against sexism and against patriarchy, but also the struggle against racism. They are really, one is intrinsic part of the other. The struggle against the destruction of nature, the social environment, the struggle for animal liberation. You know, the witch, right, was the woman who had a special relation to animals. There is a whole history about the development in capitalism and the attack on animal, the wars on animal, and which are also, part of a whole part, how you say, subjected to new forms of exploitation. And of course, today it has reached forms that are of a sadism that is unspeakable. So important to see the connection of these struggles. Number one. Number two, the witch hunt is not a thing of the past, it's a thing of the present. As I've written in the book that you mentioned, since the 90s, hand in hand with the globalization process, in ways that very much evoke the past, we have seen a return of witch hunting. And this is very important to pay attention to it. In India, in Africa, now it's beginning in Latin America, etc. And the third, and with this I end, the question, the importance that we begin to reappropriate this history. We are the ones who have to begin to reappropriate this history and see the connection. Because as you know, it's becoming clear over the last weeks and before, the importance of history to understand, for example, what leads to a cop putting his knee, on the neck for 8 minutes on the neck of a man who is dying only because he's black. We need to understand that. We need a whole history to understand the significance of something like that today. Similarly, we need to recuperate that history also of the witch hunt to understand, and also the relation of sexism to homophobia and transphobia, because gay people were also burned many times together on the same stake on which, witches were burned. In fact, the history of gay liberation is also very much connected with the history of women's liberation.
Thank you so much, Silvia, for this first part. Let's now open for questions.
Sure.
There are some people I can see who write that they lose the video sometimes, but I think it's clear by now that even when we cannot see you, we can still hear you.
Yeah, good.
At least most of us. And I don't know if, let me see, if the questions are supposed to be here. Irene Holm says, just wanted to share my experience with Northern Norway, where in 2011 a museum opened in remembrance of the witch processes, documenting the lives and accusations of 91 women's lives.
Yeah. Yeah, very important. And, the famous also monument that Louise Bourgeois, and, she made a very powerful, evocative, construct. A seat, emanating flames. Yeah.
Also, Federica is asking, could you share again the name of the project which will happen in Madrid in 21?
Right. So yes, it's a project for the memory, for the reappropriation of the history. Is la memoria por la memoria de las brujas. But she can contact me, and let me say a few words about it. This project began already 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. We have had the first meeting in Pamplona, in March in March of 2019 with the presence of a bit more than 100 women, mostly from Spain, but not only from Spain. Then we also had public meetings. And from that meeting, it began to really consolidate in the sense that there are now study groups, groups, more than study. There are groups of doing archival research, and then they're working with it. And we are, if she is interested, she can contact me. You can give my email, and I will be able to say what is being done now, what is being planned. But broadly speaking, it's an invitation. For example, it would be good if in Denmark, right, there were women who were doing the same, going to the local archive, to the local churches, the places where the records of the trials, yeah, and begin to see, what happened. What happened? Who were these women? I was part of one meeting that we had, in Barcelona, in a very small area near Barcelona, Terrassa. And a woman gave a talk, an older woman, not an academic, not just an old, and she was part of one of these groups. And what she said sums up for me the meaning of this. She said, I cannot tell you what doing this work has meant for me. I had no idea that the places where I've walked with my children, where I go to sit down on Sunday and so on, were places where women were burnt. And who were these women? She said, these were our ancestors. These are our grandmothers. And I realize now, she said, how important it is to know who they were and what happened to them when they were burnt alive has affected my life and what I learned from them. So they died atrociously and they were made voiceless. We are their voice. We are their voice. We have to make sure that they didn't die in vain, and we can give them voice and learn from them so that we are not following the same path.
Thank you. I have a question from Lode. Thanks for your generous lecture. Tonight is Midsummer Eve in Sweden, where one celebrates the fruitfulness of the blood. It's called Midsummer Blood, and the penetration of the earth. This is a pre-capitalist tradition, just as the witch hunt was in the northern part of the country before the earth was separated unequally. I have a question regarding your recent book, in which you write in the second article that we are already mutants. From the viewpoint of work, we are already living in a gender-fluid world in which we are expected to be feminine and masculine at the same time. If some kind of fluidity is a means for survival of carrying out our daily lives, how then to be abolitionist, as you suggest, and how to avoid falling into a trap of the binary as a solution to this? Many thanks from Frida.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very powerful, question, because it's true, and what I really meant is that, going beyond the binary is also redefining what it means to be woman, what it means to be man. Is redefining, in fact, I think that what is happening now, it's a period of, well, one danger is that we make a change that reasserts all category. But the challenge and the creativity is that is a moment where the crumbling of the old category make possible a reconstruction of the whole, even notion of feminine, masculine. And what I meant really there is that from the point of view of a capitalist conception right, of these categories. You know, the capitalist organization of work now wants us to be men and women at the same time in the traditional sense. In the very traditional sense. They want us to go home and perform as woman, mother, and so on, then want us to be the job and forget, right, that and work, because they found the women are the best workers, right? Because of the relationship with children, they can be made more responsible than men, right? They can be more easily, for example, in the case of debt, right? They are now discovering worldwide that no matter how bad their situation, women usually pay back their debt. You know, they are the ones who have the highest rate of repayment. Mhm. So this is what I meant. You know, I meant that when I say the more fluid, it's not necessarily in a positive sense. It's that capitalism wants us to be both at the same time. So that we have to continuously navigate from one to the other.
Thank you. I'll give you two questions this time. It's two short ones. First is Emily that asked, what do you think about the commodification of the witch and the witch as a trend? And then it's Nana Rosa who asked, would like to ask if the witch event next year is only for women or also queer and gender non-conforming folks.
So I'm horrified by the commodification. I'm horrified, and it's even worse than that, because it's not only that you know, the witch hunt and witches are being commodified, and that's bad enough. But what is happening now is that there is a new use, right-wing use of witchcraft, witch hunting, etc., to again attack women. So we have seen a number of movies being produced in recent years that are centered on the figure of the witch, on the figure of the evil woman, presented as a reality. To give you an idea, there is one in which the protagonist is a very pure, blonde, all-white woman, and she goes to bed, makes love with her partner, and then he explodes. He explodes and is all in blood, and she discovers that she is a witch. This is like, so there is now a relaunching in response, you know, as a response to the fact that many women in the demonstration have appropriated the figure of the witch as a symbol of female revolt. The response has been to say, yeah, there are witches and they're really bad women and they're really dangerous for men, and etc., right? So the figure of the witch, as I was saying before, right, is the figure of nonconformity. And it includes everybody who was not conforming sexually, not only the woman who was the mother, who was, or the peasant woman who was expropriated from the field, but for example, gay people, you know, every form of sexuality that was not conforming, that was also persecuted through the witch hunt. So that's very much inclusive of that.
The other question was if the witch event next year is only for women or also queer and gender non-conforming folks
I think
can
that was my
participate.
answer, right? I thought that was my answer.
Okay, so everybody is welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The image of the witch was, and you know, what we're talking about, recuperating the history of the witch hunt. You know, we're talking of recuperating a whole broad history of not only women, but of practices that were demonized, of practices that were made demonic because in a way they were not conforming with the new social norm and social disciplines. They were functional to the accumulation of capital.
Thank you. I'll give you two more. Womxn is asking, could you please elaborate on the connection between gender and class? And Emily asks, why do you think the witch does have such a strong and lasting appeal?
Okay, well, both are very broad. The whole history of the world there. I think that well, I want to say something about the last one first, which is that, since the rise of the women's movement, right, as I wrote several times, has rescued the history of the witches, the history of this persecution, has rescued it from obscurity. Because until the 60s, you had really a bundle of historians, right? But if you were not an intellectual, if you were not somebody who, or you probably never encountered these books, right? So they were basically, the history of the witch hunt was erased. I went to school many years. I was never taught about the persecution of the witches, about persecution of Jewish people, etc., etc. Never you were told that in the 16th, 17th, and even the beginning of the 18th century, you had women who were burnt alive on the square of the village or the town, after they had been tortured in the most horrendous way. I encourage every woman to read, a woman in the broadest sense, to read the history of the witch hunt. What was done to these women? What they were accused of? I really encourage, because it's a real eye-opener. Very few people understand. And this is what we're really trying to do. Because I think we understand what kind of society, right? In the same ways that if you really begin to seriously study the history of slavery, then you begin to understand something that I think has been papered over in the history of capitalism, with all the talk about progress and democracy, etc., etc. And yet, we know today, we see the truth of those conceptions. We see colonization. We see the slavery continues. We see the massive impoverishment of people. We see, a society that for millions and millions of people has only war, poverty, misery, epidemics. So, the question clearly with the feminist movement, when the feminist movement begins in the 70s to look into women, the history of feminism, women's struggle, etc., etc., they encounter, as I did, the real witch hunts. And immediately, you ask yourself, if they killed all these women, right? If they killed all these women, I mean, these women must have been really particular type of people. And the idea of the witch is adopted. Unfortunately, often in a romanticized way. But there's been an adoption of the history of the witch as, these were our ancestors. In Latin America, there is a slogan which is now chanted in every demonstration. We are the granddaughter of all the witches that you have not been able to burn. So in the same way that Black people have reappropriated, for example, even certain terms that were meant as terms of degradation. So the feminist movement has reappropriated a figure that was supposed to be a figure of repression, but actually they've taken it as a symbol of revolt, right? The important thing is not to romanticize and in doing this, ignore the real history. we need to understand the real history, right? Now, tell me again the other question, because in the
could you please elaborate on the connection between gender and class?
The question of gender or class, yes. I mean, you should also read, because I've talked a lot about in my books. Yeah, I say there is a connection in the same ways as a connection about race and class. You know, the fact is the capitalism not only accumulates and exploits, accumulates wealth and exploits, can do that to the extent that they diversify the types of exploitation and creates hierarchies, divisions among the people exploited, right? And so one first question is that gender, to me, stands for a particular type of exploitation, right? In the sense that you have a population, women, who are now devoted, to be exploited in a particular way, to reproduce workers, often for a long, long time, excluded from wage labor, kept mostly in the community, in the home to reproduce worker, confined to a work that is considered non-work, and in that way made dependent on men. Clearly, you had women, for example, like black women after slavery, they could not depend on men in the way the white women could, because black male did not have the same relationship to work, to wage labor, right? So there are differences. But fundamentally, gender means reproduction. Gender means being exploited as a reproductive worker, being exploited as unpaid laborer, right? Being expected to perform certain type of services, servicing men sexually, servicing them from the point of view of their daily reproduction activities, right? That's what gender means. So gender is a category of class. In the same way as race, race means somebody who comes out of slavery. It means somebody who does certain kind of work, who is excluded from certain type of benefit. So race too, it's a class category. The slave race, the black person was the slave, was a particular type of laborer. It was a laborer whose exploitation was ignored or was, disentitling for a long time, even under the end of slavery, from certain kind of benefit. So, for example, gender and race represent kind of works who are outside of the social contract of the wage, outside of the social contract. So in this way, there's a profound connection. Right.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to see that, especially gender and race as types of exploitation, like capital exploitation. I have 2 more questions. They're somewhat long, so I'll just take one at a time. Siuxi is asking, thank you so much for your talk. Would you please be able to elaborate on the relationship between the proverbial forest and witches? Is this relationship based on historical traditions of women retreating to the forest to escape oppression, or is there more to explore?
No, I think the relation of the forest to the witches has to do that many times the witches lived at the margins of the community. They lived at the margins of the village. There is a whole history of exclusion. They often lived alone in, this is a large category. It's not true because there are also urban witches. So witch and forest is not synonymous. But it's a fact that particularly in the first phase of a witch hunt, which lasted 3 centuries, right? You find that many were women in rural areas who have been pushed to the margin of the village, right? For instance, we asked at the beginning of this conversation, right? What makes a witch, right? And I was mentioning that often they were poor women, and often they made themselves very unwelcome, not only by begging their neighbors for some food, cursing if they did not receive it, but also, for example, by going uninvited to communal gathering. Imagine being in a witches in a village. You have a baptism, you have a wedding. There is a feast. The woman shows up, the beggar shows up, and they say, away, away, away. This is a very classic. And then she starts cursing everybody. And then somebody gets sick, etc., etc. So the forest, I would say that the connection with the forest has to do with the relationship with animals and with the characteristic of the emargination, the exclusion, the isolation.
There's also this word hedge witch. And I have a friend I want to give shout out to that I told you about, who has the theory of or a speculative theory of the witches just on the verb of discovering electricity like hundreds of years before Edison, right? So I want to just give a shout out to Megan Trainor, who is in Seattle, who calls herself a digital hedge witch. And it comes from the idea of the witch as also not just physically being on the margins, but also in many other ways, like being on the verge, you know, between the inside and outside. So that's also something that is to be elaborated. But this idea of the forest, or what you talked about, reminds me of the word hedge witch, which is the thing. So we have like 9 minutes left. So let's see how much we can, because there are more coming in.
Yeah.
Sonia is saying, is there any record of how witch hunts was tied to disability? In children's literature, are witches represented as older women with different kinds of impairment, exactly as Nana Rosa writes? Could it be that many were punished for not having been seen as fully productive workers as well?
Well, yeah, sure. The witch is seen, you know, she's to the extent. But you see, look, I think it's really very, very important to see that when we speak of the witch hunt, we speak of a phenomenon that over time affected really thousands and thousands and thousands of women in rural areas as well as in urban areas. So you have the witches who have, you know, the old woman, the classical image, older woman, the beggar, she's curved, right? And she's old, she carries on her body, and this is where the disability, all the signs of poverty, you know, of exclusion. And on the other hand, you know, you will find that you also have younger women who were often charged with being witches because of their, you know, lewd behavior, right? In other words, they had children outside of marriage, right? They knew, you know, they had affair with men without being married, or a relationship with men of a higher class, right? Which, of course, it's taboo. So, and we have all kinds of women, for example, adultery. It's interesting that in Denmark, right, new legislation against you know, witchcraft are brought in together with new, more severe legislation against adultery. So, for example, adultery begins to be seen as a much more serious crime than ever in the past. In England, in the 16th century, for adultery, you could be actually burnt alive like a witch. It becomes a capital crime in the same way as forms of contraceptives, which are seen as infanticide, begins to be punished with capital crime. So there's a whole new intensification of the penalties against women, and that I think has to be into. So the witch is not only the woman who is old and etc., etc. It's also a woman who is using her sexuality in a way that contradicted the new norms, right? The wife, the subordinate, obedient, etc. And I show
that she pleases herself,
for
right?
example, in Protestant areas, even the names of women begin to change, right? You begin to be called modest. You begin to have a whole set of prudence, prudence, modest.
Care.
Yes, the new kind of icon and paradigm as to how you have to behave in order to be accepted. In the book, I also speak of the change of the concept of gossip. For instance, gossip is an English word that, used to, in the 13th, 14th century, used to denote female friendship. You said, I go out with my gossip. And then within 2 centuries, the centuries of the takeoff of the witch hunt, it means what it means today. Gossip. I don't know what will be the word in Danish. Gossip. So it's futile, no knowledge, contains no knowledge, is malign. It's really bad. And it's female. It's only women who gossip. Men don't gossip,
Yeah.
And I show that this change, it's really part of a whole devaluation. It's a whole devaluation that affects every area, of women's life. But clearly, translates into punitive measures that are directly to the women who have less power, who are directed to poor women, to women who obviously do not control any form of wealth.
Thank you so much for that elaborate. Can we take one more?
Sure, absolutely.
Good long one from Melton. A lot of women are reclaiming, in quote, being a witch, quote, by doing clairvoyance, healing, acupuncture, or other forms of healing. In these cases, they are often seen as crazy, believing in the supernatural, and at best seen as an alternative to the established medicinal industry. Can you say something about how you see this falling into the circumstances that the capitalist society needs to be able to continuously exploit women's knowledge, but also undermining them if they capitalize on this knowledge?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have, I think it's very important, and it's very understood, I think, by a lot of women, a lot of people, that we really need to rethink a lot of social relation and categories. For example, what does it mean to be healthy, right? I mean, you can say crudely that from a point of view of the state, to be healthy means to be able to go back to your job, right? So once they'll be able to get you working again, that's health, right? And I think that particularly over the last 3 decades, when we have witnessed the constant dismantling of the sanitary system, the constant cuts and neoliberalization of healthcare, right? And what happened with COVID-19? It's, it's a story that was very predictable, totally predictable, because we knew day by day that the sanitary system. So in response to that, we see that in so many ways, people, and particularly women, are now reappropriating, are seeing the need to take back into their own hands, which I think is a very powerful and very necessary, move to take back into our hands the question of our own reproduction, beginning with the question of health. And so the whole idea that, first of all, and by the way, I discovered well, discovered, I mean, it's not, it's been there all along, that in the United States, at the end of the, actually at the already at the middle of the 19th century, you had a very popular movement that it was a health movement which had a slogan, every person a doctor.
Mm.
And it was born of skepticism with the official medicine, with the idea that the official doctor were there only because of money. And so you had to do it yourself. And they created a lot. They created a grassroots movement that would study the body, the herbs, and focusing on prevention. Not only on, how to cure a disease, but first of all, how do we avoid becoming sick? And this, I think, is very, very profound. Never is being so necessary as today. They are telling us now that the map of the infection of COVID is the same map as the contamination of the air. That in many places you can see that people are becoming more sick where the air is contaminated, because contamination creates lesions in the lungs that facilitate the entrance of the virus, right? So we see that is on one side the sanitary system, and on the other what is done to nature, what is done to the water, to the food, right? So it's very important to have this process. I think we need to do it collectively. To me, there's no solution except a collective solution, and I think we need to do it without romanticization, but I think it's very essential.
Mm. We have one more, because it's a good question, and it's the last one, so let's take it. It's from Ro. How do you see the values of the witch and feminized behavior, as in empathy, care work, etc., as a tool for revolutionary work?
Well, to me, again, it depends. If we look at the fact that the witch was in all a different impersonation, because many different kinds of women, all connected by one thing, that their practices, their life, their existence was not compatible with the kind of culture, with the kind of discipline the capitalism wanted to build. So, in a sense, the witch was the other, right? Was the other from a whole world of a new relation the capitalist society was trying to build, necessitated for its takeoff. If we take it that way and move it into the present, then we can adopt that, right? In the sense of, yes, today it's fundamental, a process of reconstruction, right? And I think that for us to go back continuously, to have this exchange with the past, to have this recuperation of the collective memory, that to me, it's true for the Black Power movement, for the Black Lives Matter, for any movement, for the movement for the liberation of animals, from trans movement, but to recuperate that kind of history, right? And to never, think that the world we are entering, or what we are doing, is born out of nothing. What we construct is always in a constant negotiation also with the past, because we learn from it. And that to me is fundamental. And in that sense, this is the meaning of the work that we are setting up with this network of women that are now, devoting a lot of time to reclaim the history of the witches. And I hope that many of women and men that hears me now, are going to join that effort, Because it would be great when in June 2021, we are going to have the encounter in Madrid. There'll be women coming from Denmark. And then we can join the story because we
I'll be there.
story from Denmark. So this is a really open invitation.
Where everybody is welcome to join.
Yeah, good.
Silvia, thank you so much for this marathon talk. It lasted for 2 hours without a break because we first did plan to have it that long. So I apologize to you for keeping you this long, and for those who had a bit of trouble concentrating that long. We'll reorganize that for the next one. So I just want to say thank you so much to you, Silvia, and to all the participants, and for all the really good questions. And there are a bunch of comments I look forward to read afterwards. And then I would like to finish by giving the word back to Ida Benke, who is from the Laboratory of Aesthetic and Ecology, and who is the curator of this festival. So I want to applaud you, Silvia, and then give the word to Ida.
Thank you so much. A big hug.
To you too.
And to all of you who have been listening. Thank you so much.
Ida?
Yes, I also just wanted to say a huge thank you to you, Nazila and Silvia, for this wonderful and illuminating conversation that we will all be taking
Beautiful.
with us into the world. I will be taking into Danish midsummer, so that's wonderful. And then I just wanted to also again say that we have recorded this conversation and we'll put it online. We'll figure out a way to do that, but it will for sure be on our website, lcph.pk, within the next few days. So if you would like to revisit the conversation, then please do so. I also want to say that this is the first series, the first part of a series of summer seminars on radical care practices and feminism and other important things that we will be co-organizing along with Nazila and her organization Salon Hysteria. So I really encourage all of you to stay tuned, and we will be back by August, Nazila, right? That's our plan. Yes. With more conversations around these topics. So yeah. So and then Rosa writes here, what about a transcript for accessibility? Nana Rosa will do our very best to get that out to you as well within in the foreseeable future.
Very good idea. Yeah.
Sure. So thank you. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. So thank you so much again. Wonderful, Silvia and Nazila. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you.
See you in, see you all. Hopefully in the real world too.
Hopefully in the real world. That's a long time now. So.
Okay.
Yes,
bye.
Would love to meet you. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Ida,
and bye to you as well.
making all this possible as well. Thank you, Dawn, for the introduction.
And good luck for the festival.
Yes. Thank you so much, Silvia. Thank you.